They swim around as individuals usually, but they can also form these really large shoals. A single brine shrimp is about 1 centimeter long, but these shoals can extend for meters. So the question I want to ask you now is, why do they do this? What's the advantage for them in gathering in large groups? Well, lots of animals form large groups. We've got zebra herds and starling flocks and fish shoals. And the usual explanation is that they're getting safety in numbers, right? So as a group, any single individual is less likely to get eaten if a predator attacks. But that's not what's happening here. In fact, the exact opposite is happening here. Because Artemia gets attacked by a tapeworm, a parasite that lives inside them and drains the nutrients from them. So, when the tapeworm gets inside one of the little sea monkeys, it does 5 things. It castrates them, thanks. It makes them live longer. The castration bit is the least interesting bit here, so we'll get that out of the way. It makes them live longer. It changes their color, so they go from transparent to bright red. It makes them swim quite close to the surface of the water. And it makes them gather in large groups. So the grouping shrimp are much more likely to carry a tapeworm inside them than the ones that are swimming solo. Why does it do that? Because, like many parasites, the tapeworm has a very complicated life cycle that involves hopping between lots of different hosts. And the shrimps are just an intermediary. The final host, the only one in which this thing can reproduce and create the next generation of tapeworms, is the flamingo. This wasn't planned, but this stage is about to get a lot more sinister in about 5 minutes. There are also eggs in this talk, bad eggs. Okay, so the flamingo is the final host. So if the tapeworm gets into the shrimp, it needs somehow to get into the flamingo. And it does that by changing the body and the behavior of the host it's currently in, the shrimp, by making them more conspicuous, by making them swim closer to the surface of the water, and by making them gather in these large, really obvious-to-see groups. The tapeworm ensures that its shrimp is more likely to get eaten by a flamingo. So it's in keeping with the theme of tonight's event. The shrimp's reality has been completely overwritten by this parasite that lives inside it. That is the secret of the Artemia swarm. It's not safety in numbers, it's danger in numbers. And this sort of thing happens all the time in nature. It's incredibly sinister and unsettling stuff. This idea that these hidden, unseen forces could be living inside creatures and controlling their minds and their behavior. When we think about animal behavior, we make this really big assumption, which is that the animals themselves are in charge of their actions, that they're in control. And as this example tells us, that's often not the case. And you know, if some of you are a bit freaked out by this concept, then that's perfectly natural. A lot of our best fiction, a lot of our sci-fi revolves around horrendous tales of mind control and puppet mastery. We rail at the idea that some nanny state might be telling us what to do. We find it very disconcerting, the prospect that organizations might be controlling our efforts. But this sort of thing happens all the time in nature. For Artemia, when it gets infected by a tapeworm, it's effectively, the shrimp is effectively not a shrimp anymore. All it is a vehicle for getting the tapeworm into the flamingo. Here's another example. This is a thing called Toxoplasma gondii. It's a parasite that infects all sorts of mammals, so humans, cats, rats. Cats are the important host. They're the one it needs to get into in order to reproduce. But it often gets into rats. So if it gets into rats, it needs to somehow get into cats. If a rat without toxo smells cat urine, it runs in the sensible direction, which is away. If a toxo-infected cat smells cat urine, it runs towards, straight into the jaws of death. And toxo is so subtle that if you took an infected rat, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. It might be a little bit more active, it'll be a little bit less fearful of open spaces, but it'll have this bizarre attraction towards cat urine. And the parasite is so specific that the rat will still be afraid of dog piss. It will still run away if it smells that. It's only the smell of cat piss that makes it behave strangely. And how is that even possible? The answer is really, we don't know. We know that toxo releases a chemical that makes more dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a brain chemical involved in reward and motivation. We know that the parasite specifically affects parts of the brain involved in things like sexual arousal. So it's possible that in this rat, this innate fear of cats has been replaced with something a little bit like lust. But otherwise, it's really bizarre. None of that explains why it's sensitive to dog urine but not cat urine. And that brings me to the other really disconcerting thing about mind-controlling parasites, which is that they are often incredibly simple creatures that are infecting the behavior of things that are much more complex than they are. So remember the tapeworm at the start. A tapeworm is basically a long intestine with a mouth at one end and some genitals. And it's controlling a shrimp, which is much more complicated than it is. Toxo is even more ridiculous. Toxo is a single cell, and it's infecting the brain of a rat, a mammal brain. I think this is the thing about parasites. They can seem really, really terrifying, and especially for us, because we place so much importance on our independence and our sense of free will, that this concept that things could be manipulating us is really disconcerting. And yet,